Hey, and welcome back to our series on different types of stress. Today we're going to be talking about the dark side of stress. Stress as most of us think of it. Toxic stress. This video is going to focus in particular on acute toxic stress, and the next part of our series goes into chronic toxic stress. We'll be talking about both chronic stress and CPTSD. Definitely come back for those videos. But today, let's focus in on what happens to us when we go through a seriously stressful or threatening event that is beyond our ability to cope. Even with these really big, scary, or catastrophic events, I want to say right off the bat that most acute toxic stress reactions eventually lessen and resolve themselves over time without turning into trauma, but they can. And if it does, this is what people might think of as big T trauma, or again, what us therapists call single event trauma. These are going to be events that might involve real risks to our life, our health, or our safety. And it's some of the same types of events we talked about when we covered tolerable stress, but we don't have the support or the resources to feel like we can cope with them. So we might be looking at something like losing a loved one, surviving a natural disaster or a serious accident, experiencing or witnessing violence. And without having resources or support to get through those events may shut us down and feel truly unmanageable. If we take a common example of losing a loved one, no matter what, that experience is going to be extremely painful and destabilizing. And it's going to feel different if we have other close supportive relationships and community to help us navigate that loss than if we feel like we're completely on our own grieving that person who meant so much to us. So without supports, that's where we see that same loss turn into toxic stress and have more wide-ranging impacts on our physical and mental health. So what actually happens to us when we're experiencing one of these kinds of events? The first thing that's going to happen during the event or maybe shortly thereafter is our nervous system is going to activate, sending us into fight, flight, or freeze. And if our nervous system can't deactivate, we can't eventually reground, that's where we start to see acute stress turn into ongoing or chronic stress. Staying with single incident toxic stress for now. After our nervous system activates, we have two main physiological responses. First, we release stress-related hormones like adrenaline and dopamine that are preparing our body to take action, to protect ourselves if we need to. And second, our HPA axis activates, which is going to raise our cortisol levels throughout the body. If our cortisol levels stay elevated for too long, what we start to see is that our stress response actually becomes blunted and our bodies may eventually go into cortisol suppression. We see cortisol suppression happen more in people with PTSD, which can lead to a reduced fear response, a reduced ability to activate and respond to new threats. When we look at how acute toxic stress impacts our brain, one of the most important things to factor in is what age should we experience that stressful event at? And if it was when we were children, did we have adequate adult support to get through that? We see the most impacts on our brain for acute toxic stress when this happens to us as children, when our brains are still developing, we're still trying to understand the world, and we really need that adult support to get through one of these kinds of events. The main brain areas that are impacted by acute toxic stress include the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, the amygdala, the medial prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and several neurotransmitters. And we see different impacts on our brain depending on when in childhood that adverse stressful experience happened to us. If we experienced a toxic stress event in infancy, we might struggle to meet our key developmental milestones. We might show more aggression and have more tantrums. and struggle a lot with transitions and higher anxiety around transitions. In school-age children, this can affect our academic skills and make it harder to retain detailed information. It can lead to more disruptive behavior again and cause other learning or organizational challenges. For adolescents, acute toxic stress can cause a difficulty keeping up. Juggling school, work, and home life. We'll see higher impulsivity and risky behavior oftentimes, and it can make processing rapid information or making quick decisions a lot more difficult. While as adults, we don't experience the same brain development impacts from acute toxic stress, there are still notable effects on our bodies, especially our nervous system, endocrine system, and immune system. How does this kind of event actually feel for us emotionally? Most of the time, it's going to be this big, overwhelming mix. We may feel exhausted, confused, sad, afraid, agitated. Sometimes it might be numb and dissociated, and we might feel tense and physically aroused all at once. And it's important to name that all of these emotional and physical responses to acute stress are normal. And again, our body is built to resolve and work through that stress reaction on its own without leading to long-term issues like PTSD, in most cases. Again, that's going to depend a lot on the support we have available to us. So how do we know when an acute toxic stress reaction has become trauma? According to the DSM-5, if we're still experiencing a lot of intrusive thoughts, depression, dissociation, physical arousal, and avoidance for more than a month after the stressful event, those symptoms may then be classified as PTSD. Keep in mind, 1 month is a relatively arbitrary metric, but it's at least something to mentally reference. Some other signs that an acute stress reaction may be more severe are if we feel like we are in almost constant emotional distress and physical arousal and tension, and we're really struggling to find moments where we can calm ourselves. We may also be experiencing more frequent dissociation, have a higher level of intrusive thoughts and memories that won't go away even when we're in spaces that should feel safe to us again. If an acute stress response becomes PTSD, this is a lot more taxing to our bodies and our nervous systems, so we're going to start to see some additional symptoms like persistent fatigue, sleep issues, nightmares, fear that that traumatic event is going to happen again, flashback-related anxiety, depression, and avoidance of things that remind us of the trauma. Emotionally, people with trauma often feel a lot of anger, fear, sadness, and shame over what happened to them, whether or not they're tapped into or expressing those emotions. It is really common for trauma survivors to swing between emotional extremes. Sometimes we may feel way too much and be overwhelmed by this mix of painful emotions, and other times we may swing into a state where we're emotionally numb and dissociated, and we can't feel anything. Because of these swings back and forth, trauma survivors often struggle to regulate their painful emotions, and this is even harder if that trauma occurred to us earlier in life. This is one of the reasons why many trauma survivors turn to self-medication or some way to emotionally numb themselves to manage their emotional pain. And that's part of why we're going to see higher rates of substance abuse and other high-risk behaviors, including self-harm. Some people who aren't able to consciously feel and recognize their emotions also experience what's called somatization. We see this a lot in cultures that tend to be more emotionally restrained, where people aren't showing or talking about their feelings very much. And so we see this somatization of our emotional pain that's coming up in our body as physical symptoms, even when medical tests and doctors confirm that there's not a physical ailment or physical cause for what we're experiencing. The source is actually emotional. Finally, experiencing a traumatic event can change our core beliefs about ourselves, other people, and how the world works. If this happens, this is going to change how it feels to be ourselves and exist in the world day to day. Sometimes a traumatic event, depending on what happened to us, can alter our belief about other people and our relationships and really affect our ability to feel safe around others and to connect again. Many trauma survivors avoid emotional closeness or support if they've come to believe after what happened to them that no one can understand, no one can help them. They may not be able to trust anyone. Early trauma especially tends to create strong feelings of betrayal and a fear of being betrayed again in the future, which can lead to persistent anxiety that others are going to hurt us again, they'll take advantage of us, or they'll seriously disappoint us. Other trauma survivors might be afraid not of other people disappointing them, but of letting other people down, and they may carry a lot of guilt over feeling like a burden. There may be a lot of guilt over the fact that they're struggling to manage their emotions and they may not trust themselves fully around others. Because of this, a lot of trauma survivors often feel ashamed of and are also often judged for how they're struggling with their stress reaction. And that can lead to even further isolation and disconnection from support. Although acute toxic stress and PTSD create significant impacts, it's really important here to note that traumatic reactions and PTSD symptoms are still pretty rare. While around 70% of people worldwide will go through something potentially traumatic in their lifetime, only about 5.6 go on to develop PTSD. So most people who experience acute stress have a short-term intense reaction that usually resolves on its own without those serious long-term effects. Our bodies and brains are built to be resilient. We are built to adapt. So we have this incredible natural ability to heal even from really awful, scary experiences. And we're all going to cope with stress in different ways. And there is no single right way to process or heal from severe stress. Some of us are going to be more action-oriented, solutions-focused. Others of us might slow down and reflect a lot more. Some of us may express a lot of emotion and want to talk through what happened. Others may be more emotionally restrained and keep it more to themselves. And the old idea in therapy was that you have to talk about your trauma and you have to verbally express the emotions related to it. But research shows that's not true for everyone. The most important thing is figuring out your own individual coping style and strengthening that. What matters more than the way that you cope is whether your coping style can eventually allow you to keep going with daily life again, to get back to a place where you feel like you can manage your emotions more, to feeling better or at least okay about yourself, and eventually to open back up to connecting with and receiving support from other people. By tapping into our own individual coping and healing strategies, and especially by connecting to more social support, again, over 90% of people recover from acute toxic stress with time. I say that again because big T trauma and PTSD get a lot of attention, much more than chronic stress, but they are more rare. And in many cases, long-term chronic stress, what we might think of as little t trauma, can actually be more harmful to our health and well-being than a single big traumatic incident. I think one reason that PTSD gets more attention is that it's just easier for us to understand. It's more straightforward when we can explain our behavior and our stress reaction when we have this one clear incident to point to. For people with chronic stress, feeling understood and validated for what we're experiencing, if this is small things that have happened to us again and again over time, can be a lot harder. And it can increase our feelings of loneliness or disconnection. No matter what kind of stress or trauma you've been through, I hope this video helps you feel seen and gives you at least some relief by naming and explaining some of the really common impacts we see with acute stress. This is also a video that you can share with people in your life who may want to support you, but just not get it fully, or struggling to understand some of what you're still working through and dealing with as you're healing and processing from that acutely stressful event. So I hope this feels like a helpful resource for you and for your loved ones. And definitely come back for the next part of our series on complex trauma and chronic stress.